Okay, I think we will get started. There will be people coming in, but in honor of the time. So Mike, Scott, and I met in 1994, I think, soon after I moved to Seattle. He was working for a group called Earth Ministry, and what was just been so beautiful about it is that what started as just sort of a collegial kind of a relationship for me to get a sense of what Earth Ministry does, and for him to build a partnership with a congregation just has turned into a 30-year friendship. And it's just one of those wonderful graces. So about a month ago, when I realized that that Earth Sunday was coming up, I just sort of thought there's no better person to reach out to and hope that he is free, and he was. Nice. So, Mike, it is great to have you. Thank you so much for being with us, and it is your time to use as you wish. And we do have the handout that you said. Thanks so much for preparing the handout as well.
Oh, you bet. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Dave, thanks so much for the invite. It's a pleasure. You should know, all of you there, I periodically would watch worship from. I was living in Wisconsin during the pandemic, and sometimes I would zoom in to watch your service. So I've seen the inside of your sanctuary a little bit, and would enjoyed listening to Dave's sermons and so on. Yeah, it's a delight to be here. I've been working in this field of caring, connecting faith and spirituality, caring for creation in some ways almost for 30 years, although my jobs the last 10 years or so haven't been as closely connected to that. But it feels very comfortable in a way to be in this setting where a group of people connected to a faith and a spirituality are thinking about things on a deep level, and we get that chance to connect. So I really appreciate that. I wonder if we could have a moment of silence just to gather ourselves into this space, even though we're in different spaces, but to be present to each other in this space. Let's have a moment of silence. Thanks. For all the beauty around us and for each other, we give you thanks. Amen.
Amen.
So you have that handout. I'm going to share a little bit about myself, to ask you all a question, touch on theology and worldview a bit, and then the question, how shall we then live? But I think our stories are sacred. Frederick Buechner, at the beginning of his trilogy, autobiographical trilogy, the first book is called The Sacred Journey. He says, what I will attempt to do now is to try listening to my life as a whole, for whatever of meaning, of holiness, of God there is in it to hear. And not in sort of a navel-gazing way, but in a sense of, if I take out the scrapbook of my life and share it with you, maybe you will be inspired to take out the scrapbook of your life to find moments of meaning, of holiness, of God in your own life. And it's in those moments, I think, that we might hear a call. And certainly, there have been moments in my life that I have felt called me to this work. So I went to Wheaton College in Illinois. Some of you are probably familiar with it. It's a fairly conservative evangelical school. I studied biology there. And then I went to Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., and was part of Samaritan Inns. I lived and worked in a home for formerly homeless men. And that was a very, if you want to categorize it, quite a progressive, social justice oriented faith community. And while Wheaton had that side of it, it wasn't what you'd predominantly get there. So very different faith communities. But I don't remember ever hearing a prayer or a sermon about caring for the earth in my growing up days at Wheaton or at Church of the Savior. So I was getting a certain worldview, just like you all did and do, in society, but also in the church you go to, in the college you went to. There is a worldview that defines how we see things every day. And mine was, within the Christian communities I was a part of, the fact that we actually lived on an earth was kind of, it's almost like the earth didn't exist, in the sense of there wasn't a recognition of how we are actually part of earth. For example, when I say the word environment, or I say the word nature, do you think of yourself at all? When I say the word community, do you think of air and water at all? It's because I would have bet that most of us, when we say the word community, we would think of our friends, our neighborhood, our church. And when I say the word nature, I bet we don't think of ourselves. So we're growing up in a world where essentially we are seen as separate from nature. God is seen as separate from nature, and it's a pretty anthropocentric or human-centered worldview. And so after I was in DC for 4 years as part of Church of the Savior, I went to grad school at the University of Oregon in environmental studies. And there I read this article by Lynn White, The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And he essentially blamed Christianity for the worldview that indeed separated us from nature, separated God from nature, and was very anthropocentric or human-centered. And I was like, yeah, you got a point. But I also felt, well, but that's not inherently, or is that true? You can have a worldview or a theology that may not be accurate. And so I began to look into that. I think he had a good point in terms of how theology had developed in Western culture, separating us and God from nature and so on. But is that sort of the fact? Is that true? Or is there actually both things in Scripture and in our own experience that would suggest a very different relationship with all of life? And so I began to look into that and really wanted to help wake the church up. There were some churches that were involved in social justice issues and the fact that we're called to care for people, but there wasn't that much about, hey, how about caring for Earth as a whole, including people? How about caring for, connecting social and environmental justice? And I felt called to do that. And so I created a course on environmental justice, theology, and sustainability to teach in churches. And that's really what then led me to Earth Ministry for 11 years, which is an organization in Seattle that connects Christian faith with care and justice for all creation. And then I worked for 4 years with the National Episcopal Church, the national denomination, as economic and environmental affairs officer. So that's a little bit about me and what drew me to this work. I'm going to just go back to my notes a little bit here. I've just been going at it here. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, when I was in grad school, I think I shared this with Dave when he asked me to talk today. I read an essay in every year, World Watch Institute in Washington, D.C. put out State of the World. It was a collection of essays by leading researchers on the state of the world. And one of them in the early 90s was Denial in the Decisive Decade. And it was about denying what was going on. And they, as people watching the science and the culture carefully, thought the 90s would be a decisive decade. And as we know, there was a lot of denial. Denial has continued in many ways. So, it's one of those disheartening parts of my story when I remember that essay, its impact on me, and then working for 20 years specifically in this field and 10 years additionally tangentially, and how there's still a lot of denial. the other thing that in grad school, I led wilderness backpacking trips in the summers. And I remember actually, Dave, talking to you about this years ago, how in some ways when I mentioned our stories and that they're sacred and that ideally we would be giving space to listen to our stories and for those moments of hints of where we might go. And I was leading this backpacking trip, and there were two llamas. I was two llamas in tow because I was resupplying the group with rock climbing gear and food halfway through their trip in this case. So I was walking back out of the wilderness 15 miles with two llamas in tow. And because I was on my own heading out that day after they were staying in longer. I was just the floater, a resupply guy. And I came into this grove of aspen trees. And it's almost like the aspen trees, it felt like the aspen trees parted for me. The trail went through the midst of them. And I felt like we were one. Like they were, in a sense, recognizing my kingliness, if you will, but I was also recognizing theirs. So they had parted, they were welcoming me. And there was no sense of separation. It felt like a dance. And I wonder if, that is really the reality, rather than the separation that we so often live out of, that there's actually a dance of creation going on all the time. And what we have the opportunity to be part of is that dance, and to live in such a way that kind of celebrates and honors that deeper reality of oneness, of connection, of relationship, rather than a worldview that has separated us so thoroughly. I mean, last Sunday in my church, the preacher said, indigenous activists. I go to a UCC church out there, the church that Dave used to be in. And indigenous activists would say that the ecological crisis is primarily and foremost a spiritual crisis. And it's that sense of separation that is the crisis, because that separation leads us to an economy that sees it as separate from the rest of the world, for example. So what has been particularly challenging for me, I don't know, the last decade, is that, when I was at Earth Ministry in the Episcopal Church, I did a hell of a lot of speaking and writing and editing. And so I had a lot to say. But lately, I actually led a retreat for the church out here last fall. And I started it, and I could have started this session by saying, I don't know what to say anymore. Because of the grief, I guess, because of the grief that I feel. And when what do you say when you hear that since the early 1970s, the world's wildlife has been reduced by almost 70%? That species are going extinct at a rate not seen since the disappearance of the dinosaurs. Or, what to say when droughts, floods, fires, hurricanes are increasing, as we hear in the news. And that it seems like many of the climate change models, they were right, but not right enough, if you will, in the sense that many of the predicted outcomes or impacts are coming sooner than were those models originally projected. So I guess I have named grief as something that I'm experiencing. And I guess I would also just remind us, I've mentioned species extinction, I've mentioned climate change, and to remember that because we are all so connected, those things impact people greatly as well, as we know. Okay, I mean, droughts, wildfires, the impact, the reality of climate refugees and so on. So, when I was in the early 90s and 90s, and in some churches almost having to argue that caring for all of life was part of our call as people of faith, I could simply start, well, okay, let's say we are only called to care for people and God doesn't give a damn about what happens to the rest of creation. Well, I mean, that's silly almost, but if that was the case, you still have to have a healthy place to live, right? You still got to have a healthy home and good air and good water. And so anyway, I would like to ask you, with that somewhat extended intro to what brought me to this work, and if you were to say a word or two words about, what does Earth Day mean to you or bring up for you, or, how do you feel about climate change? If we could just go around the room and share a word or two words that capture a bit of that feeling for you.
You can't prove prevention.
What's that?
So you cannot prove prevention. So you cannot know where we would be today without earlier efforts. It could be a whole lot worse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm serious.
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
are a lot of things. I remember doing poverty work. You never know where the threads drop, and you never know where they will lead. And that's up to God. And
Right.
I'm sitting here watching out our window, birdies feeding little birdies.
Wonderful. Thank you. Who else has something they'd like to share? If you could just go around and say, hey, I feel X, or
Interconnectedness.
thank you.
Sorrow.
Sorrow.
Desperation.
Desperation.
I wish I understood why so many who deny climate change and science have Christian roots.
Thank you.
Tension.
Pension. Okay.
I can't help thinking about our grandchildren.
Yeah. I don't have any children, but I have a beloved nephew. Yeah.
I worked in the insurance industry, and I would say they're climate change ambassadors because actuarially they can prove that it's happening. They've known it's coming for a long time, and they've been trying to prepare. But they talk climate change all the time within that particular part of the economy, the insurance area, P&C and commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you have a feeling about all that yourself that you can identify?
Also, I just was closer to it throughout my life because I was in an insurance company. So we talked weather all the time. We talked about how it was deteriorating the coastal areas. And so what it causes is that left certain states, we've left certain parts of certain states. You change your the way you're going to insure based on where the maladies are. So we used to, but now there's no safe haven. That's what we know right now. So you used to say, let's get away from coastal. And then it's like, well, get away from the fire areas and get away from the tornado zones. And now there's no place in the United States that we can say we want to write a lot of insurance in that area because we feel safer. There's no safe haven in the United States anymore.
Wow. Thanks.
Sure.
Well, along those lines, it's kind of ironic that I think the Defense Department is another place where they've done some very robust future planning around climate change, because a lot of their facilities are so dramatically impacted by sea level rise and stuff like that. And I don't consider them to be progressive, I mean, they're quite, I would say, conservative, but yet they've bought in for decades into this idea that we need to change our planet because of what's going to happen and stuff. and the disruption to around the world to destabilization and how that affects our defense department and our defense posture.
Yeah, very true.
I
Anybody
feel
else? Go ahead.
exasperation or frustration.
Yeah, thank you.
We've been down in Florida on Bar Island. And they've got for sale signs up to build new houses right on the ocean. How stupid can they be?
Is it stupidity or hopeful? Or ignorance?
Ignorance.
Greed.
Anybody
Green.
else have a word?
Greed's good.
Or maybe I've heard from everybody. Can't quite tell.
No.
I don't know how to make my care about this real and effective. I can know the impact of some of the stuff I do, but I still love flying places,
Sure.
and I can bike any place that I can, and that will not make up for one airplane
Right.
flight to someplace I want to go. So I think it's that sense of what am I willing to do,
Yeah,
and how might my money or my time be used in any kind of effective way to make any kind of a difference at all.
When I said tension earlier, that's
Yeah.
the tension I was.
I wonder,
thinking
John,
of.
if that was a piece of it.
yeah,
We were just discussing even like as simple as the things you buy that are in plastic, thinking, I gotta stop doing that. And then yet it's a lot of work, like, okay, how do if I want cookies, they're all coming in these plastic containers, and then, oh, I better make my own. You know what I mean? And just, and then at the same time, when you try to do stuff, does one person's stuff really make much difference, and you get discouraged.
yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons, Dave, one of the things Dave and I talked most about then when we talked about my being here today. So in the remaining time, why don't we, in a sense, let's talk about, how shall we then live, maybe is the one way of thinking about that question. And I'd like to look at it in two different ways, or three maybe. Worldview and theology, a little bit about that, because fundamental, if let's say indigenous activists pointing to this being a spiritual crisis, there is a role for the faith community to, if you will, challenge its own theology and importance of doing so, such that, and whether or not people go to church, you could say that the Christian worldview, as Lynn White was criticizing it, meaning God is separate from nature and so are we, and humans are what matters, that those ways of thinking are predominant whether or not you go to a church, in America, let's say. And so, there is still a role and a need for the theology and worldview that are promulgated through our churches and in our faith communities to get it more right, if you will. And I want to read so we could look at worldview and theology briefly, and then a bit about grief and feelings, I think. And then I want to share a website that's very specific about how shall we then live when it comes to reducing our carbon footprint, just thinking about climate impacts, let's say, which are so central to so many environmental issues. So I want to start by with a bit about worldview and theology. Philip Sherrard was an Orthodox Eastern Orthodox theologian, and he put it in pretty stark words. And I want to read a bit from an essay of his. and his book was Sacred Cosmology and the Ecological Crisis. He says the industrial and technological inferno we have produced has not come about accidentally. It is the consequence of allowing ourselves to be dominated by a certain paradigm of thought that impels us to look upon ourselves as little more than two-legged animals whose destiny and needs can best be fulfilled through the pursuit of social, political, and economic self-interest. To correspond with this self-image, we have invented a worldview in which nature is seen as an impersonal commodity, a soulless source of food, raw materials, wealth, and so on, which we think we are entitled to exploit and abuse by any technique we can devise in order to satisfy the self-interest. And, you know, when I went to grad school at the University of Oregon, I was, I think, the only person of faith in my cohort of grad students there. You know, it's a pretty liberal place without a lot of people feeling a lot of respect for religion. And one of the reasons, you know, to go a bit with that Sherrard quote is that, you know, in Genesis 1, we're given the commandment of, you know, we're say our role is to have dominion, right? That famous verse in Genesis 1. And if you don't look into it deeply, you could easily see how a group of environmental studies graduate students would say, well, that's ridiculous. You know, there's no hope for a worldview that says we have dominion over this place. If it's interpreted as dominion as kind of ruling over and in a domineering way. And yet, if you go just a little bit further, Genesis 2, our role is portrayed as quite different. And why is it that dominion is known so well and not Genesis 2:15, where we're put on the earth to tend and keep the garden? And actually, if you look at the Hebrew words there, they are abad and shamar. So abad, if you know the Adam and Eve are put in the garden to abad the garden. And the garden is, or abad is actually the same word that shows up in Joshua. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will abad the Lord. So if you literally were to translate abad, one of the literal translations could be serve. And then the word shamar, that's the one that's translated keep. And you can keep a cucumber in relationship with all that keeps it alive, you know, by keeping it physiologically and not picking it, or you can pick it and put it on and can it, and then it's not kept physiologically anymore, right? And it's the sense of keep in that regard in shamar is to keep physiologically. So Adam and Eve are put in the garden to serve and keep physiologically the garden has a fairly different connotation than the word dominion. And then also, I've also read that another way of looking at dominion is that in a Hebrew culture, kings had dominion, but a good king was one who exercised that dominionship, if you will, with mercy, justice, and compassion, which goes a lot more along with the idea of serving the garden. So just an example in my own life of a theology and how it was interpreted by my grad student friends, and other kinds of theologies you could even get out of the Bible just one chapter later. So there's this need for, I think, for us to be addressing our own theology and worldview. And then I put in here a couple of Martin Luther quotes. You know, what if we had a theology that, or a view of creation and how we were connected to it and related to it based on this: God's entire divine nature is wholly, entirely in all creatures, more deeply, more inwardly, more present than the creature is to itself. So, any comments on theology briefly and its importance? And, you know, do you feel like you're getting a theology and a worldview now that might be different from how you were taught growing up?
I think one problem that I feel with theology sometimes is that theology almost always tends to deal with the supernatural. And it seems to me, on the other hand, that almost everything to do with our world, our history, geology, and all is entirely natural apart from any God.
You know, that's because for me, I think, I mean, that's problematic in a sense, because theology shouldn't theology be applied in every, like, shouldn't it affect how we then live? Because it sounds like, I mean, I wonder if for you, well, it also makes me think about some theology, how it's mainly or the part of the Christian worldview in some Christian circles that says, you know, we're just passing through, and you know, this world is not my home, those sorts of things. So we're the goal of life is to be saved and go to heaven, and so it doesn't really matter what you do here. I don't know if that's at all partly what, that's one of the things that your comment made me think of, which is a theology that is very problematic, obviously, if you're asking people to care for what's happening here. And while I found Wheaton challenging in a lot of ways, where I went to college, one of the things I think was good about Wheaton is that it did say, hey, you know, your faith is not just something you do on Sunday, or, you know, it does impact how you live your everyday life, or it should inform, or it does inform how you live your everyday life. Anyone else have a comment they'd like to make?
I often think these kinds of issues are a lot easier with a smaller population.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say population control, but this world has grown. And what do you do about that? And what do you do about people scraping by? And it also affects religion. I mean, as populations grow, it's harder to have people share your views.
Well, yeah, I mean, the other part of population, of course, is the amount of impact, the per capita impact. Americans have the largest carbon footprint of any other group of people, for example. So, you know, I think one could advocate for policies that address population, if that's sort of a big concern. The other side of that is to say, well, what I have control over is parts of my own life and sort of my per capita contribution to things, which is what I have felt called to, you know, be part of addressing, is sort of our per capita impact, because those are things I have, my impact is things I have more control over. So why don't we move on to, with those very brief comments about, you know, how should we then live in terms of how we think about things and the worldviews and theologies that we promulgate, to a few comments on grief, I guess, is what I would like to say a little bit about. And I mean, some of you expressed words like sorrow or desperation, exasperation, frustration, tension, care for our grandchildren. And, you know, if we're, it seems to me that grief and words associated with it, they're obviously not comfortable feelings often. And you know, in our personal lives, if we're grieving about something and don't have a place for that grief to go, it often turns into, well, it could become depression, right? It could become a real heaviness, could become anger, maybe. It can come out in a variety of ways. So we do have hopefully places and people and rituals that help us deal with grief in our own lives, or these hard feelings of sorrow or loss. And I wonder if, as a culture, we are in a space of grieving our losses ecologically. You know, because if if indeed the deeper reality is that deep connection to aspen trees, that little story I shared with you. You know, we evolved in relationship with all of life. So if that relationship is hurting, and we see evidence and hear evidence of it so often, wouldn't it make sense that we would be grieving? That there would be a sense of, as Terry Tempest Williams says, we're bleeding at the roots. You know, we have taken our love inside and abandoned the wild. So it would make sense just that we would be grieving these losses. But I don't think we really have a space for acknowledging that, or rituals to let it out. And I guess there is some, so I wonder if part of our inaction or sense of overwhelm is unexpressed, unrecognized grief that we begin to feel as we walk through the world these days. And that we need to find ways and rituals and places for that to be expressed, such that the depression and heaviness is not as significant. Indeed, at that retreat I led last fall for the church out here, we had a ritual of grief that, at least for me, and I think for some, you know, it moves in some way then if you have a ritual space for it. And I want to read a couple quotes that I found so powerful related to grief, and they're on your handout. Stephen Jenkinson, there's a documentary referenced in the resources part of your handout. There's this documentary about his work, because he's worked with people in palliative care and hospice. He says that grief is not a feeling. Grief is a skill. And the twin of grief as a skill of life is the skill of being able to praise or love life, which means wherever you find one authentically done, the other is very close at hand. Grief and the praise of life side by side. Isn't that beautiful? Acknowledging that, and I'll go on. The second quote, Francis Weller, this great book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and he does talk about ritual in there. Grief and love are sisters woven together from the beginning. Their kinship reminds us that there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for what we once held close. And of course, that could apply to losing a loved one, a loved person. It could also apply to the grief we carry about ecological losses, about a place that has been degraded, for example. And acknowledge, so, you know, the quote at the top of your handout by James Baldwin, it goes to love too as really our only hope. And so I guess I want to say too that grief is a beautiful thing in the sense that it reveals, it shows the depth of love that we carry for a relationship. And so, you know, and I love how Jenkinson is saying, hey, grief and the love of life go hand in hand. And so, therefore, in some ways, is to be celebrated and acknowledged. and is a very human thing. But it does strike me that perhaps one thing that our faith communities can do is to create a ritual or spaces and rituals in times of grief. You know, we have funerals. Do we need to have spaces for people to come together to acknowledge grief about ecological losses so that that can be felt and held together, but also kind of moved? You know, if we don't have this opportunities for grief to be expressed, that stuckness can come. And I wonder if that's part of our stuckness and denial in our culture. So those two things, you know, the worldview that we get in our faith communities, the opportunity for faith communities to perhaps offer rituals of grief, those are two ways of thinking about, well, how shall we then live? And then the third would get to sort of very practical things, like Dave was saying, you know, he can bike, but he loves to fly too, and we all probably all do. So I want to, in our remaining time, highlight a website that a very good friend of mine actually just released. It's called Climate Responsible. Brad Leaquist is a friend of mine out here, and I edited the site. He asked me just to edit it, you know, and he's one of the country's leading practitioners, but I would say also advocates and educators around net zero carbon living. He does it with, you know, school districts like in Madison, Wisconsin, or Salt Lake City, these large institutions who are seeking to decrease their carbon footprint. But this site is all about our individual carbon footprints. And I think I can share my screen here. Can you see the website now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I would recommend, you know, you spend a little time with this. I think he laid it out really, really nicely. But, you know, his comment here is, oops, wrong page. And I you know, he says, I believe that malaise and despair many feel stems from the uncertainty about what to do and a sense of inevitability and inability to make a difference. Many folks I know desperately want to take responsibility for their carbon footprint, but aren't sure what makes the most impact. The truth is we can radically reduce our carbon footprint, but only if we act. And in taking action, a sense of hope is born. And so it's very practical. You know, he's like, what do you want to do? Well, okay, what should I do? And then there's these four tiers that he has laid out. The first one is to take to measure your own carbon footprint. There are some great tools out there. Thing about Brad is that he's very thorough. And so he's like, this is the best carbon footprint tool, just use that one. And then, you know, and then these various tiers get more and more challenging, but it gets very detailed. Like, what's the best light bulb? What's the best, you know, heating unit? What's all these, you know, convert all lighting to LED, install vacancy lighting switches. I mean, replace shower heads. So it goes from the very simple to the very more challenging, and also sort of, you know, inexpensive to more expensive, but these tiers. So it's laid out in tiers 1 through 4, and then there's a section on why. And if you wanted to also sign up to be on his web, you know, to get he's going to blog once in a while. You can sign up to be on his newsletter list, his blog list, to hear from Brad. So I would really recommend spending some time with this. And in some ways, I mean, it's not rocket science in the sense that for many years, I remember back in probably almost maybe 25 years ago, the Union of Concerned Scientists put out a book called The Concerned, what is it called again? I can't remember the title all of a sudden, but they basically did all this research, as the Union of Concerned Scientists does, and they said they wanted to one of the most effective things individuals can do to decrease their impact. And like this website, a lot of what Brad focuses on are transportation. That's the number one thing we do that has impact, our food choices, and how we care for our homes. So a lot of Brad's, very practical suggestions backed up by data focus on transportation, food choices, and how we care for our homes as well. I did want to highlight too here, one cool thing that is hopeful is, if you can see here, American carbon footprint per capita has dropped over 25% since 2005. It's not all bad news. We have become more efficient and less carbon intensive over the last 15 years. That's somewhat mitigated, he goes on to say, by our population is increasing, as one of you commented on, and also carbon dioxide, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb all that is still being exceeded. And so carbon levels are still going up, as you know. And of course, it's a worldwide issue, not just an American issue in terms of becoming more efficient. But I was encouraged to see that data point that he highlights there. I think I'll stop sharing now. And see, I'm going to just check my notes a minute here. So, Dave's question was, what are the meaningful ways we can change how we live? I do know people who have given up flying, because flying is one of the most impactful things that we do. I haven't done that yet either. I don't eat beef. I eat pretty low on the food chain. Food choices are one of the most impactful things we do. And Brad kind of hammers that in this site, says, we got to stop eating beef. And he has other very practical suggestions related to electrical vehicles, related to advocating for 100% renewable energy options, that if you can pay for that, sometimes your utility will provide an option for you to pay more so that you can get 100%. You're sort of increasing the market, if you will, and the funding for that sort of electrical generation. And therefore, your electric vehicle can be essentially carbon free if you're getting sourced from renewables. But I guess I'd be happy to open it up to see if you have thoughts about that "how shall we then live" part, that you feel inspired or empowered or discouraged about as you think about things you can do. And I guess I would also just say, even one of I can't remember who, I can't really see you all that well, but one of you did say something like, you cannot prove prevention, you never know. And I guess that is one of the things that I find hopeful, if you will, is that we do not know how this all is going to pan out. The models and the predictions are very concerning, but there's still, we don't know where this is all headed. And also that every 1/10 of a degree matters in terms of climate change. When you look at the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, and they say we know this to a very high certainty, or this to a lesser certainty, but they also talk about what the models will say if you don't go to 3 degrees Celsius or 2.5 degrees Celsius warming, you'll save this. You know what I mean? They have some pretty specific predictions about levels of loss related to even tenths of a degree, so that we are going to face losses, and we are already. but it does matter what we do now in terms of the extent of that loss. And I find that in other words, there's still things to fight for. We may have lost, we likely have lost 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which was the aspirational goal adopted in Kyoto. And we may not stop it at 2 degrees Celsius, but it does matter the levels to which that rise will occur. So any comments about your own lives and
So,
Yeah.
I used to feel a lot of frustration and beat myself up because I wasn't necessarily going to the extreme of what people propose to help things.
Yeah.
You know, earlier I said there's a tension. Well, I've also discovered there's a balance. So, like with the flying thing, maybe you don't fly as much, or it's interesting. We're big Rick Steves travel fans, and he actually contributes large sums of money that he takes out of his profits to offset some of the carbon footprint of his travelers by donating to a number of organizations that mitigate carbon production around the world. So, I mean, I guess that tension and that balance, and when I mentioned interconnectedness earlier, every single decision we make, believe it or not, has an impact. And like my wife mentioned, buying cookies in a plastic clamshell, or turning my thermostat up to be a little more comfortable at home in the wintertime rather than just putting on a heavier sweater or something. I feel like that we need to just have that awareness that it's not just for us, it's for our kids and our grandkids, and it's every decision we make affects the whole web of interconnected things: water quality, air quality, carbon footprint. And then there's also a social justice thing too, because the poor get affected greater because things are cited in where the poor live, or it's cheaper to live near a factory or something like that. So yeah, it is kind of overwhelming, but I think you just kind of have to have a mindset and give yourself a little grace. And yes, there's tension, but you can find a balance, I think, in your own life. Hopefully, I don't know. That's my little speech, my soapbox.
Yeah, I ran into a little wall on Friday. I have a friend that lives in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is the capital of the country of Georgia, and spent some time with him at his home in Eugene, Oregon, in early January. I wanted to send him a gift in Tbilisi. So 2-pound box, small box, 2 pounds. Take it to UPS. Want to ship to Tbilisi? $356.
Wow.
A $90 jet fuel surcharge.
Oh,
So I'm going to make toys in the States again, and I'll ship it. I'm shocked. It's nice they're doing that. Yeah, I'm just saying, so there's some things economically that are inhibiting some of this carbon footprint stuff. It's just $90 to ship a 2-pound box. I was shocked.
That's interesting. Well, it points to the power of policy to change behavior. So you can have changed mindsets, you can have worldviews that begin to help us act differently. You can also pass policies that, a tax shift that would make something really expensive. And I'm not going to do that anymore, not because I care for the earth or someone, it's because it's too expensive. So that it does point to the role of advocacy in creating a lower carbon footprint society, for example. And the other thing I would like to close with is the word tov. It's the Hebrew word tov, and it's on your handout there, as well as a quote from Terry Tempest Williams. Because tov I have found really beautiful. It's the word, it means good in Hebrew. And it's the word that the writer of Genesis used, when God says all creation is good or very good, it's very tov, T-O-V. And Cynthia Molabita, an author and professor, in her book, Resisting Structural Evil, says that one of the connotations of the word tov, one of the reasons it's good, is that life, God is saying, life creates the conditions for more life. And that's true, isn't it? If life is allowed to be, it creates the conditions for more diversity, for more beauty. And that is very good. And it strikes me that that is fundamentally our call, is to become part of that tovness and side on Tov's side, that our lives would contribute to the ability of life to continue to expand and be productive and diverse. And, I think, and that grief and that tension come in there because we're also aware of parts of our lives that don't contribute to that. And that's where, your point about offering grace to ourselves comes in as well. But I don't think, I don't have an easy, way to respond to that, because it's where we are as a culture right now, is living in that tension of the knowledge of the impact, as well as our desire to be caretakers and to be lovers of life. And, I don't have time to read it, but I believe I put in there Terry Tempest Williams' quote, which is perhaps, one of the most beautiful essays I've ever read, called Winter Solstice at the Moab Slough. And it's about being open and willing to fall in love with all of life and to have our hearts broken. And for me, love flows through a broken heart. And it is those things that break our hearts that maybe we need to move toward rather than run away from. And in doing that, we will offer our lives on the side of what is Tov, what is offering new life to earth. So I end with that, plea to love, to put yourself in places where you're aware of the brokenness and you move toward helping to heal it in your own lives in whatever way you feel called to do that. So thank you so much for the chance to be with you all. I know it's time to
Mike, there was one more question. Could we do that before we finish up?
Oh, sure. If you got, yeah. I thought you had to run, but
it actually isn't as much a question as it is just sharing something. Last year, I went on a site to look for a new electricity plan for the church. And you said you could pay a little bit more to have 100% renewable. We actually paid less. And as a church, we got a 4-year fixed plan for 100% renewable energy. And so Sarah and I did that at home too. So residentially and commercially, there were cheaper, not all of them, of course, but reasonable plans. And we, for the church and at home, could save on the cost per whatever that is, whatever unit, to have 100% renewable energy at the church and at home. So there's an apples to apples website here that we can look at that, and I'd be willing to help anybody look at that personally here at the church, because we've been considering at home whether we get solar panels, and it just doesn't make sense for us. But at least we're getting 100% renewable energy.
Great, thanks for that example. And the other thing I would like to just mention is Bill McKibben's organization, Third Act. I think if you're interested in kind of gathering with other people who he's saying those of us, you know, who are 60 or 65 and older and are maybe retired or moving toward retirement, we have time and we have money, and it's our responsibility and opportunity to get involved in creating a culture that addresses climate change. You know, Bill McKibben's one of the leading environmental activists in the country. He started 350.org with students, and now he started Third Act. And I think it will be it's a hopeful place to put some energies as well, if you feel so moved.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. Very good.
Good to see you all.
Mazel tov.
Yes, one.
Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.